Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Rogers Smith, and we're going to be talking about Rogers' new book, which is co-authored with Desmond King, which is called America's New Racial Battle Lines, Protect versus Repair. And we're going to talk about that book, I think also get into the Constitution a little bit, various political goings-on, contemporary events within the U.S., But first off, Rogers, thanks so much for joining us. I was hoping you could start by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your political development and also how you became interested in questions around race and American politics.
Well, thanks very much for having me. My interests come from the fact that my extended family is all in the Carolinas. I was born in South Carolina, but after just a few months, my family moved north to Springfield, Illinois, a state capital and the adult hometown of Abraham Lincoln. And that meant I grew up in an environment of politics. I also came from a conservative Protestant business family, and we were Republicans. So my early political involvement in my teenage years was with the Republican Party in Illinois in the 1960s. But being from Springfield, I thought of myself as an Abraham Lincoln Republican, committed to civil rights. And that was a period in which the conservative movement around the country and in Illinois was pushing the Republican Party to back away from civil rights and pursue a Southern strategy, which some of my South Carolina relatives liked, but which I found deeply, deeply disturbing. And so I began to change my politics in a lot of ways. That led me to become a political scientist. I was not initially focused, though, on issues of race and politics. But in the early 1980s, in the Reagan years, I began a study of the history of American citizenship laws. And that made it abundantly clear to me that throughout American history, there had been those who believed that America was supposed to be, as Stephen Douglas said in his debates with Abraham Lincoln, a white man's nation. And that kind of understanding was incorporated in American citizenship laws through our history. A lot of our history, American political development, is a struggle against racially restrictive and hierarchical laws. And so that became my chief area of academic research interest from that time on.
I wanted to turn to your most recent book, as I mentioned, co-authored with Desmond King, which is America's New Racial Battle Lines, Protect versus Repair. And you lay out two sides or ways of framing American racial politics. Those two sides are protect and versus repair, protect and repair. Before we dive into the two sides, I was curious why you decided that a new framework was necessary.
Well, Desmond King and I had been writing together on issues of racial politics in America since 2005. And we argued that America has been historically structured between rival racial policy alliances, some pushing essentially to maintain a status quo that favored whites, some pushing for egalitarian change, with battles over slavery versus emancipation, Jim Crow versus desegregation and integration. And we argued then that in the modern era, late 20th, early 21st century, the dominant issues had been conservatives abandoning racial segregation, now championing colorblind policies, which they thought might permit the nation to become more integrated over time, but without active efforts to favor people of color, and those who thought that instead, if we were to achieve an integrated society, we needed some race-conscious measures like affirmative action. And we noted that those debates shaped a whole range of other issues. But as we moved into the 2010s, new things were happening. The police killings of Black men, especially people of color more generally, led to the Black Lives Matter movement. And at the same time, or shortly thereafter, we saw the rise of Donald Trump, who was talking about the dangers of immigration, about discrimination against traditional Christians, and about what he saw as a radical left that was attacking traditionalist Americans, and particularly traditionalist white Americans, in ways he thought is unjust. The point was, conservatives weren't talking about colorblind policies, and Black Lives Matter was talking about much more than affirmative action. So we saw a shift and a heightened polarization in the racial policy debates, and we began trying to understand that change, map that change, and that's what led us to write this book.
Could you lay out the two sides of what you call contemporary America's rugged and dangerous political landscape? So on one side we have protect, and on the other side we have repair.
Certainly. The protect side does continue in some context to support colorblind policies, as, for instance, in admissions programs to higher education. But for the most part, they don't talk about principles of colorblindness nearly as much as their predecessors of 2 or 3 decades ago then. Instead, they present America as being torn apart by what they see as a kind of radical assault by progressives, globalists that are seeking to overcome, displace, maybe even eradicate, especially traditionalist white Christian men whom they present as the most discriminated against victims in a modern America. But they think more generally that the secular culture and cultural and economic elites are simply hostile to most traditionalist Americans, and they have to be protected against them in a whole variety of spheres of American life. And on the other side, the repair side, there's a conviction that the program of the previous generation of trying to integrate into American institutions by race-conscious measures like affirmative action, if necessary, that doesn't go far enough because American institutions display too much systemic racism, institutional racism, so that simply integration into those institutions isn't going to be sufficiently transformative. They think that those institutions need to be much more dramatically repaired or transformed, and ambitious policy agendas to try to achieve that goal.
Just thinking on this point and what you've said so far, where have you all located the shift, if you will, perhaps a turn from a discussion around race-blind politics towards more America's fundamental institutions or values are under attack? And then perhaps on the other side, a shift from integration towards more substantial reforms. Is it around mostly the rise of Black Lives Matter? Where was that point?
The rise of Black Lives Matters is a very critical point. We don't have an exact single moment. We think that these kinds of shifts arise when a variety of factors converge. And the people on the protect side, the people on the repair side have different and conflicting stories, partly overlapping, but significantly conflicting stories of how we got to where we are. Each side blames the other for the most part. But I think it is true that the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement made many conservatives feel that they were facing pressures for radical change, whereas the other factor is that Barack Obama's presidency proved deeply disappointing to many progressives because, in response to the economic crisis in 2008, his administration did much more to bail out the banks than to help ordinary homeowners in trouble, and particularly Black homeowners often lost their homes in ways and suffered economic damages in ways that they subsequently struggled to recover from, and they felt Obama let them down there. Also, we saw the increase with the aid of new social media in the visibility of police killings, and it made it look like having Obama in charge had not altered the fact that this was a country where governmental coercive institutions used power in cruel and unjust ways against people of color. And that led to some significant radicalization of the left demands for political transformation and racial justice in America.
I was curious if you could go into what sort of narratives these two sides present, how they describe the contemporary goings on within the country.
So on the protect side, the conservative side, there are different versions of the story. Some go back to the progressive era, where they believe that the rise of new pragmatist progressive perspectives that were dismissive of the Constitution, dismissive of notions of natural rights, and placed great faith in social engineering to bring about improvement. They see that as the first wave in an evolving modern American liberalism or progressivism that gets increasingly radical but from the outset is deeply challenging traditionalist American ways of life. In the name of democracy and human flourishing, the conservatives regard it as deeply damaging, and they see that as pushed further in the economic realm in the New Deal, pushed further in the civil rights realm in the Great Society years. But under their story is that 1960s saw to the left of the Great Society a radical new left and radical Black nationalist movements, soon to be followed by other kinds of nationalist movements, Black Panthers, Young Lords, Native American movement, AIM, and so forth. And their story is that while these movements were discredited to some degree due to their use of violence in the early 70s, their members and people attracted to their worldview eventually succeeded in coming into power in most American institutions outside of politics, certainly in higher education, also in the media, and they believe even in corporations. And they helped give rise to what came to be called DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives, with the creation of HR DEI positions in public and private institutions, corporations, universities, government bodies, etc., and supporting DEI industry of consultants and so forth. Their account is that this entrenchment of what they see as a radical left in major American institutions has led ultimately to concerted assaults on traditionalist American ways of life, again, with white Christian men the most vilified and victimized in their views. And so they say it's necessary to take over the political realm and use it to restructure the other institutional spheres of American life to restore what they think of as justice and the traditional values that made American great. That's their story. On the left, there is an emphasis on the undeniable fact that America began as a white settler Christian colony or set of colonies, and they argue that from the outset, American institutions have been structured to protect the identities and the interests of the propertied white Christian men that led the revolution and their successors. Those groups have always been the most privileged and unjustly privileged in American life, so that there is this deep systemic racism in all American institutions. They accept that there have been struggles against racial injustices that have had some victories in American history without, they believe, dramatically and fundamentally transforming the system. And again, for them, the Obama administration was an indication that it wasn't enough to elect a Black man as president. There were still economic policies that favored the rich over the poor, and particularly people of color. There was still the use of state power to serve the status quo at the expense of those who are suffering under the status quo. And So they do believe that there's a need for much more substantial, even radical change. And the rise of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement has only confirmed in their eyes that very sweeping change is needed if deeply conservative forces are not going to be in power forever.
You point out in the book that the Senate is malapportioned. There's gerrymandering in the House. The Electoral College can and has done recently chosen the loser of the popular vote to become president, including obviously Trump in 2016. And that the political playing field isn't a neutral one. It would seem to me that folks engaged in the Repair Alliance would have an interest in taking up these constitutional issues, looking at these larger structures. I'm curious where you feel the Constitution and our political structures fit into all of this.
I think it is true that the Constitution, which was a remarkable innovation at its creation. At that time, countries were not governed by written constitutions, and very few countries in the world could be deemed Republican forms of government with some significant element of popular self-governance. So having a written constitution for a republic, that was a very novel project, and the innovations that they made reflected both experiments and compromises amongst the, in many important ways, conflicting interests and aspirations of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention and the people that they knew that they would turn to for ratification of the Constitution. The Constitution did provide protection for the interests of propertied white settler men, that many of them invested in slavery, many, even more of them, eager to acquire land at the expense of the Native Americans, concerned to protect their property rights. All of these represented positions that shaped the Constitution and early institutional structures in ways that have many continuing legacies. That's undeniably true. It's not the only aspect of the American founding that has shaped our development, but these are fundamental aspects. And so the Constitution they designed is, in most of its particulars, not one that is seen around the world as well designed to further democratic self-governance today. We have had waves of constitution making especially in the post-World War II era, the late 20th century and early 21st century. And most of those constitutions don't have the kind of separation of powers. They don't have the kinds of systems of representation that are features of the American constitutional system. They are much more substantially democratic constitutions than the original U.S. Constitution. And that Constitution, as it happens, has had some of its undemocratic features amplified by the political geography, the demographics of the 21st century, in which we have lots and lots of more rural areas that tend to vote conservative and are overrepresented in state legislatures and in the Congress and in the Electoral College. So it's undeniably true that the Constitution we have is in many ways deficient from the standpoint of democratic aspirations. Now, trying to change that is enormously difficult precisely because power is structured in the way it is, and it's sort of a law of political physics, if you will, that bodies in power tend to stay in power unless acted on by an outside force. Those who are in power because of the current system are not likely to change the current system. So the Repair Alliance does have a lot of ideas for the further democratization of the American system. They have not focused primarily on restructuring political institutions per se, in part because that seems so hard to achieve. I do think, however, that if a really democratizing, transformative agenda is to be pursued in the future, those issues will need, as you're suggesting, to get a lot more attention. I'd say that the Repair Coalition so far both invokes constitutional rights on behalf of those it represents, and at the same time generally dismisses the Constitution as a white settler colonial project that's pretty hopeless. And there probably needs to be more attention to specific and concrete projects of institution building, political institution building, to try and move us beyond the deficiencies in the Constitution. Up till now, the repair agenda has focused primarily on seeking new forms of economic assistance, like the Evanston Reparations Commission focus on housing assistance, and on transforming representations of our history at historical sites and in the kinds of portrayals we have in museums and in public monuments and so forth, more the symbolic or narrative dimension of an understanding of race in America. There are not a lot of initiatives that are specifically aimed at restructuring our political systems to address the evils that I do think the Constitution involves. So I think that's a project that has to be taken more seriously going forward. Amongst the academic critics of the Constitution, like Aziz Rana and another law professor, Sanford Levinson, others who are friends of mine, people I admire, there is this call for a new Constitution, and I understand the motivation for it, but I'm afraid I don't think it's realistic to think that we're going to get a new Constitution. We're not likely to get a Constitution Convention called. If we did, it's not likely that we would get results that would make the Repair Alliance or progressives more generally happy. Instead, I think the challenge has to be working within the existing constitutional structures to find ways to improve the existing constitutional structures. And some of that's maybe not so sexy or exciting, but things like the national popular vote, where we push some more states to agree that they will cast their electoral votes for the popular vote winner if enough states make that commitment to be an electoral college majority. That is a way of making the constitutional system more meaningfully democratic without an amendment which we could never achieve. And similarly, the adoption of genuinely bipartisan districting commissions for designing the state legislative and congressional apportionments, seeking ways to make sure we have an expansive, inclusive franchise, and seeking to limit, if not eliminate, the role of the filibuster in the Senate. These are a variety of kinds of things that are more attainable to make the Constitution more operate in more democratic fashion. And I think there's more hope going in those directions than longing for a constitutional convention that isn't going to happen and would be unpredictable if it did happen. And let me note something else about our constitutional system that makes the kind of reforms I'm talking about seem more attainable than they otherwise might. Yes, the Constitution was written largely by and to express the interests of property white men, but at the same time, the Constitution did create a system that generated pressures for more expansive self-governance, for a more inclusive democracy that have reshaped the Constitution over time with the Reconstruction Amendments, including the enfranchisement of people regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the expansion of the vote to women, direct election of senators, presidential vote for the District of Columbia, and the expansion of the vote to 18-year-olds. If you look at our constitutional development, you see processes of democratization that have improved, in my view, the original Constitution over time. And for better or worse, I think that's really the only viable path forward under current conditions.
I usually find myself thinking of Sanford Levinson's term. He calls it the hardwired elements of the Constitution, bicameralism, the unelected federal judiciary, a president that seems to be getting stronger and stronger. So it seems perhaps that within the realm of constitutional change or wondering about the Constitution, there's a general acceptance that things need to change, and then how that will actually take place, if it can come through a convention, if it can happen in other ways, at least that conversation is taking place.
It is taking place. Would that we were making more progress. I would add to the list of things that need to be addressed that your comments remind me of. The architects of Reconstruction thought that the central institution in American constitutional self-governance should be the Congress, the most representative body of the American people. And indeed, the framers of the original Constitution thought Congress would be the most powerful branch of government. That's why they divided it and put in other checks and balances, because they thought precisely because it could claim most of all to be the voice of the people, it would have the most power. Now, the Constitution is hardwired in some ways, but there have also been significant shifts over time, and one that you alluded to is that in the modern era, the presidency has grown more powerful. So have the courts. And that's partly because Congress is the institution that, in my view, is failing most severely in modern American constitutional governance. It has, for a variety of reasons that are disputed, that we could discuss, its members are obsessed with obtaining funding for re-election and not getting primaried, and they spend less time than they used to in Washington engaged in legislating. And when they do legislate, it is, as we've just seen, not really deliberative self-governance, but rather they roll everything together in one huge bill, beautiful or not, which most of them have not read, just literally not read all the way through, and they still vote on it. They have abdicated much of their authority to the executive and judiciary. They pass a big bill and then say, you decide how it's actually going to operate and now what money is going to be spent. And so if we're really to strengthen American democracy, Congress is the key institution. And I would add, I do think that what both conservatives as well as progressives call the second founding of America, the Reconstruction Amendments, they're the best place to look for the principles and sense of purposes that should guide how we conduct our democratic institutions.
Many people on the political left, I'd say, are critical of the Democratic Party. In fact, you probably don't necessarily need to call yourself a self-described leftist. I think these days, much of the polled support for the Democratic Party is pretty darn low. Many folks are also critical of what's been termed the nonprofit industrial complex. So I was curious to what extent you see the Repair Alliance wrestling with this question of a political party, of who represents their interests. It would seem that within this discussion of protect versus repair, of course, looms the question of political representation. And if these positions have any political power, and if they don't have political power, what do you do to try and get it?
Well, the question of what you must do to get political power is one that I think many in the Repair Policy Alliance, many on the left more generally, are now beginning to take more seriously than they did just a few years ago. You know, the outrage over police killings grew and reached a peak with the killing of George Floyd. That produced a really extraordinary outpouring of new funding for racial justice organizations, and for a time, a new willingness in the American public to support more substantial efforts at reforms. And that led to a feeling of optimism that came crashing down with the re-election of Donald Trump. There was a belief by some of the radical members of the Repair Coalition that they could build a powerful political coalition simply through people of color, with demographic change diminishing the percentage of America that saw itself as white, and with the assumption that most people of color would join in a repair agenda. But what we saw in 2024 was that many people of color both share some of the values of more traditionalist white Americans on economic and social issues, and they were not convinced that the progressive left had much to offer them or was even really thinking about them. Again, what they saw as Obama's neglect seemed only more severe in by the time you got to the 2020s. And so the belief that you could just build a coalition, a fundamentally non-white coalition that would eventually govern the country in a far more progressive way, that's gone. That dream has evaporated. And now people are trying to figure out how to build coalitions. They have not yet found either a key issue or a key voice, a person to represent this direction. And I think that they can succeed in coalition building. And that's what people are going to be looking for over the next few years.
Well, in terms of finding a key voice or some form of political representation, how does Trump fit into this? How does his administration fit into this? And then when you're looking at current events, do you feel like what's happening now validates the protect versus repair perspective? Do you feel like Trump and his administration fits into this dynamic that you've been talking about?
Absolutely. Trump is the champion and the leader of the Protect Alliance, and he has brought it into power. There was an America First party before Trump, and it was inspired by the candidacy of Pat Buchanan, but they didn't then, and it had many of the same issues that Trump supports, including tariffs, but they didn't have a charismatic leader that succeeded in mobilizing support. They weren't playing on such an extensive field of resentments as Trump has played to very successfully since 2016. So Trump is definitely key to the Protect Alliance. How powerful it will be without him remains to be seen. But it's also true that while we presented American politics as most likely to go in a protect direction. That's what we say in the end of the book. It's not the direction that we would prefer, but it's what we expected. The second Trump administration has been more ferocious than we anticipated in pushing this protect agenda. One thing, we knew that they would attack DEI. We didn't think that their attacks on DEI would include, threatening to defund and defunding institutions of higher education, intimidating law firms, firing a host of public workers if they were suspected of DEI involvements at all, taking over the Kennedy Center and cultural institutions and threatening the Smithsonian and going after media companies. It's a much more aggressive agenda in the same direction, but much more aggressively and rapidly and intensely pursued than we expected. One thing that we noted, but probably underestimated, was that this cultural assault on DEI is in alliance with those in the conservative movement who believe that, again, going back to the progressive era, we built up an administrative state that they regard as fundamentally unconstitutional. And so there are a lot of people, the Russell votes in the administration, that are determined to strip away the modern administrative state, and DOGE was brought in to make that happen. And so the anti-DEI, anti-administrative state agendas converge to create assaults on a number of American institutions so extensive that in some ways the term protect doesn't capture it as fully as it might, although it's all done in the name of protecting the people that we presented Trump and the Protect Alliance as concerned to defend. So we do think that it has, if anything, over-demonstrated the argument that we were making.
Building off of that a little bit, how have you seen the folks who we might call repair, or the organizations within the repair organization, react to Trump?
Well, I think The Repair Alliance is clearly in need of repair at this point. And again, the key policy issues, the key voices that will prove capable of building a broader coalition that can regain power, those issues and voices are not yet in evidence. I do think that there are a lot of good ideas and a lot of good people that hold out the promise of achieving them over time. And from the standpoint of liberals or progressives or the Repair Alliance, the sooner the better. But I think it involves first the new emphasis on policies that can be attractive to a broader range of Americans, not just those that have been victims of historic injustices, many of which continue today. And that does mean, as more and more people are saying, an emphasis on attacking the neoliberal policies of both parties that left a lot of people behind, people of all colors. And that requires Democrats to say our party did things wrong. I recently heard an interview with Pete Buttigieg where he began moving in that direction. Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, has given speeches to that effect. There need to be more of that acknowledgement and then a push for an economic agenda that a broad range of Americans can see as beneficial to them. And Democrats, progressives need to restore their credibility that they will pursue that kind of agenda to the benefit of all. And I also think that they need a more compelling narrative in which many more Americans can see themselves as having a place, a narrative that emphasizes strictly America is hardwired to be a white patriarchal capitalist nation, and that's never going to change until we overthrow the system. That's not a narrative that can build broad support amongst Americans. You can't deny the highly unequal and unjust features of American life, past and present, and our institutions. You also, however, have to have a story that calls attention to the principles and the movements and the people that have strengthened and improved America historically, and give people a sense that by building on those precedents, we can improve conditions in this country in ways that they'll benefit from, that a broad range of people will benefit from. And so that kind of narrative of America as a flawed country that has nonetheless had some achievements to build on, that needs to be articulated more fully and persuasively.
Well, to close out talking about narratives, next year is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I was curious what that anniversary means to you, and then part and parcel how people who want to improve the state of the country can use that narrative.
Well, for me personally, the Declaration represents both the very best in American traditions and American principles and commitments, and clear evidence of the many values and interests that have stood in the way of realizing those best principles and aspirations. What I see as the best principles are the great statements in the second sentence of the Declaration that all men, and we should now say all people, are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure those rights, governments are created deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed by. So an ultimate popular sovereignty. Those were commitments put in the Declaration that have historically been invoked by every reform movement in the history of this country that has accomplished some good, including workers' movements, feminist movements, civil rights movements. The Black Panther platform still invoked the Declaration of Independence all through our history. Now, at the same time, the Declaration's grievances includes complaints that the king has incited insurrections by encouraging people subjected to enslaved labor to join the British side and be emancipated by. That's what they're referring to when they talk about inciting insurrections, that the king has restrained them from taking the lands of those the Declaration calls the merciless Indian savages. The king has extended his protection to French Catholics in Quebec. How terrible is that from the standpoint of Protestant Americans? So, the values and interests that are much less egalitarian, less inclusive, less just, you can see them in the grievances in the Declaration. But members of the founding generation knew that the language of the Declaration, the appeal to equal rights of all, had radically transformative potential. Some in the Continental Congress didn't want to use such language. They just wanted to talk about the rights of Englishmen. But they knew that, in fact, their legal case in terms of the rights of Englishmen was pretty shaky, and many of them were influenced by idealistic elements of Enlightenment philosophy, and they knew that they could build a broader coalition if they used the language of natural rights and the inalienable rights. So they put that in the Declaration. It led to a subsequent debate over whether the Constitution was really a means for achieving the purposes of the Declaration or, in fact, represented different concerns only for ourselves and our posterity, as the preamble says. Early state constitutions in the Revolutionary period put the language, as in Massachusetts Constitution, all men are born free and equal, like in the Declaration of Independence. But that was used to end slavery in Massachusetts. So they didn't put that language in the Constitution. They couldn't have gotten it past South Carolina and Georgia in particular if they had. So there was a debate all through the antebellum period about whether the Constitution really aimed at the universal egalitarian goals of the Declaration. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party were formed around the view that while the framers of the Constitution did not believe they could realize the principles of the Declaration immediately, they didn't know how to do it. As Lincoln said, they set it up as a maxim to be gradually fulfilled over time, never fully approximated, but as Lincoln said, spreading and deepening its influence and contributing to the happiness of all people of all colors everywhere. That was Lincoln's understanding of the Declaration. Whether it was historically right or not, the Constitution was changed as a result of the Civil War. It came at enormous cost, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, the second founding, represented a victory for that understanding of the Declaration. The Speaker of the House at the time of the 14th Amendment's adoption, Schuyler Colfax, championed the amendment, saying that the 14th Amendment in particular would be the gem of the Constitution because it embeds the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, indisputably. And since then, I think Americans can and should see themselves as firmly committed to a Declaration of Independence project of trying to find institutions and policies and ways of life that enable all our diverse conceptions of happiness to be pursued as successfully as possible. Now, we have a lot of policy differences over how to achieve that, whether through markets or government service programs, colorblind or race-conscious policies, what form democratic institutions should take, etc. But I think that progressives, those on the left, should nonetheless say, look, we're trying to carry forward this Declaration of Independence project, which is now constitutionally mandated. If it wasn't clear at the time of the original Constitution, it's clear since the Reconstruction Amendments, the second founding. And that is a sense of purpose that all Americans should embrace and share. And then we can fight over how to achieve it. And those fights will be real and serious, and the answers are far from clear. But we'll be telling the American people that some of us are not enemies and the evil opponents of the rest of us. Rather, we're partners in a very difficult enterprise, but we can and should look to find ways to work together to further that enterprise. That's the kind of narrative of America and its political project that I think we need if we are to build coalitions powerful enough to address its unjust and undemocratic features and continue the progress that we have achieved historically, maybe even to a much greater extent than ever before.
Well, that point around coalition building, forming movements of people, I think that's something that all sorts of political persuasions, but certainly the left has been grappling with and continues to grapple with. What kind of language, what kind of ideas, what history, what symbols, what does that mean? Can one find redeeming qualities within it? Is the radicality to sort of push it aside, put forward something completely different? And so I think a lot of that will come up within discussions around the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which I like to think will create some openings for putting forward some real critiques of the Constitution, of the existing political systems, but can do so in a way that sort of connects to maybe a long project of obtaining universal and equal rights and realizing those maxims within the Declaration of Independence.
I share that hope.
Well, Rogers, thanks so much for coming on and talking with us. And I really encourage folks to check out your book and begin diving into your work, and the investigations and everything just continues. It's not an end, it's the continuation.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Luke.